Camera. Are you recording everything?
I'm gonna this. Mhm. All right.
Videos there again on the website. It will, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's fine to circle back a lot, right? Are you ready, Maria? Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, welcome everyone to our next BIOS seminar. It's great to have you aboard with us online. A lot of us on Zoom, and we're recording this, so it's great for all of you who are able to join live and later. And also for those of you who are here with us in person, it's great today to have Dr. Julie Stamm here. And she's been with us last year, talking about her awesome book, looking at the brain on youth sports. She may refer to that a little bit today, but today's work is hot off the presses, computer still being processed, but Julie's research is in the area of concussion research in sports. So today's going to be a really good session, and it fits in this broader context of the work we're doing in BIOS, which is bringing research to bear in athletics in different ways. And we're doing that here on campus at UW. We're also looking at working broader, and say that as we're making all kinds of changes in college sport, as college sports are ramping up in so many ways, in good and exciting ways, but also in ways we're not sure about, we also want to take like the good and the beautiful things we do on our campus, the research, the engagement is done all across our campus, and bring it to bear throughout the state. So Julie's work is very relevant to that. We did, one of our researchers on our BIOS team did a little scan of Big Ten sports related researchers, and just came up with this initial search of just like page after page of people doing all kinds of research, from like business stuff to leadership and health sciences stuff, concussion research, all kinds of things. So part of our task is to bring together all of these people on campus here, but then also across the conference, and make that research visible and relevant. So Julie's a leader in that. So thank you so much for being with us today, Julie. We're excited to hear about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research I'm doing right now. I just want to say a bit about myself, because I know for a lot of you have no idea who I am. So my wheelhouse area is not necessarily in rugby, but that's an area I'm branching into. My background is in athletic training. I received my degree in athletic training from this fine university. And I went out to Boston University and I studied chronic traumatic encephalopathy at the CTE Center, along with this idea of age of first exposure to repetitive brain trauma in youth sports. That's my real passion area, something I'm very interested in. I wrote a book about it called The Brain on Youth Sports, and I think every kid should have the opportunity to play sports. Sports are so important. I just think we can do it and protect the brain at the same time. And the research, there's been a lot of research, not a lot, but a growing amount of research on this age of first exposure idea. It really needs to be designed based on what we know about brain development. And I think that's what's so fascinating, is thinking about how brain development intertwines with this idea of repetitive brain trauma in youth sports, and how we can promote brain development and protect the brain. I did do a recorded talk about this through BIOS earlier in the year, so I'm not going to dive in depth in this today, but I'm always happy to talk about this with anybody who wants to. Today I'm going to focus more on the study of rugby that we are currently doing, and this idea of the knowledge that our athletes bring in, our patients bring in to this setting from wherever they're coming from, and how that might influence their behaviors. So this study really started because a student on campus contacted me interested in concussion related research. And he happened to, because of COVID and taking online classes, be able to sign a contract with Major League Rugby, which was awesome for him. And it was his first year in the league, and he came back and he was really interested in this idea of concussions and wanted to do research. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized there's no mandated concussion education in the USMLR. It's only been a league for 5 years. They have no screening tool that they are really using for immediate return to play, aside from the head impact assessment, which is World Rugby kind of assessment. And they have a really diverse group of players. So there are athletes who are from all over the world, wide range of playing experience, and they're bringing a wide range of knowledge about concussions into the league. Some of them with very little knowledge or a lot of misconceptions. Some who have what we think of now because there are laws mandating concussion education throughout throughout the United States, and we I think tend to feel like people know a little bit more than they necessarily do. So the objective of the survey that we did, we decided that we were going to create a survey, and we did this along with a colleague who spoke here recently, Christine Baugh out at the University of Colorado. And we developed this survey to try to get an understanding of where are we starting. We can't really create an intervention with concussion education and try to make a difference with safety in the league if we don't know where we're starting at. So we wanted to know about the USMLR players' previous concussion education, their knowledge, their attitudes and beliefs towards concussions, and what their previous concussion history was, their behaviors. And we wanted to understand their perceptions of the stakeholders involved too. How do they feel about the medical staff and the league, and how comfortable they are reporting, things like that. We wanted to know what they even know about the head impact assessment, because this year, the 5th year in the league, was the first time that they actually implemented any form of the head impact assessment in the USMLR, and see if these athletes even know what that is. And we wanted to try to synthesize this information in a way that could help improve player safety in the league. Just want to give a little bit of demographic information from the survey. 228 players from this season completed that. It's a little over a 50% response rate. It's a little hard to judge exactly what that rate was because rosters are shifting and the exact number of players shifts a little bit within the league. The average age was about 26 years old, but ranged, actually that's a typo, it should say 21 to 39 years old. And we had athletes from 12 of the 13 teams. The amount per team did range a bit. And almost 40% had not played outside the US. There are rules where the roster needs to be composed of a certain percentage. I believe around 50% have to be people who are from the US to be in the league, but then about half are international. But about 38% have never played internationally at any point. Most people were in their first year in the league as well. And we do have a wide range, majority of white players, but also, a relatively large number of Pacific Islander, New Zealand Maori, a very wide range of backgrounds for these athletes, which isn't always seen as much in other sports. We gathered a lot of data. It was pushing being a pretty long survey, but a lot of this we haven't really dove into yet, aside from some descriptive statistics. We got information on attitudes, beliefs, those pressures, the trust in the staff, education. What I'm going to focus most on is this idea of concussion history, knowledge, and concussion reporting today. So before I dive really into that, I want to give a bit of history of what is a concussion. So back in 1933, the NCAA Medical Handbook for Schools and Colleges described a concussion, and they said, a little hard to read this, but the seriousness of these injuries is often overlooked when one realizes that a concussion of the brain should be defined as bruising of brain tissues, often accompanied with actual bleeding in the tissues. One may realize that this condition should not be regarded lightly. There's good and bad in that statement. Concussions are not necessarily a bruising of the brain, and often most of the time have no bleeding associated, that we know now. But the idea that it should be regarded with concern, and it is serious, is important. And I also want to point out, it says loss of consciousness occurs only in the more serious concussions. Dizziness or a sense of daze is common in slight cases. Okay, so they're already saying back then, you don't have to lose consciousness. Then we get to, I also want to point out one other thing that is just an interesting side note, that in this 1933 handbook, they say there is definitely a condition described as punch drunk, and that recurrent concussions in cases of football and boxing demonstrate this. So they're saying that there essentially is a long-term consequence, somewhat similar to CTE. Even in 1933, they were acknowledging that with football, but then, that really kind of disappeared for a while. So it's an interesting thing to point out. Then we get to the 40s, and all of a sudden, loss of consciousness seems to be required again, often followed by retrograde amnesia. In 1943, it was defined as a concussion was defined as a type of traumatic paralysis that undergoes spontaneous resolution. So kind of a dramatic definition there. And in the 1960s, the grading systems were introduced, really emphasizing loss of consciousness greater than 5 minutes. That evolved over the following decades into multiple types of grading systems that we see here. And post-traumatic amnesia and loss of consciousness are really important there. Grade 1 was no loss of consciousness, and then down to grade 3 where there's longer loss of consciousness, but that's something that really evolved over time. By the time I got out to Boston and had the opportunity to work with Dr. Bob Cantu at the CTE Center, that was in 2010, and he at that point would say his grading scale is should not be used anymore. We know now that grading concussions is not really useful because someone can lose consciousness and be a lot better in a day or two, feel a lot better in a day or two, and someone can just not feel right and not feel right for months. So every concussion is different, and we know that these grading systems really aren't as useful as they were thought to be. So there's been a lot of change in this idea of what a concussion actually is over time. When we got to the concussion in sport consensus statements, the first was in 2001, and the most recent conference just happened last week, but the most recent paper was from 2016. There's a lot of controversy with this. Dr. McCrory just had a lot of papers that were retracted recently, and there was a lot of controversy with the lack of acknowledging long-term consequences of concussions in these consensus statements. So it'll be very interesting to see what changes come out in the newest consensus statement, which will probably be published within the next year or so. But the 2016 consensus statement, really all of them are pretty similar, calling a concussion a complex physiological process affecting the brain induced by biomechanical forces. That hasn't changed a lot. There have been a few tweaks, but now it is considered to be a traumatic brain injury. So not just something separate. Sometimes we consider it to be, there's a concussion and then there's a traumatic brain injury. It's just a form of traumatic brain injury. And a couple of important pieces were put into these consensus statements. One, that a concussion may be caused by a blow to the head, which most people would understand, but also that it can be caused by a blow to the body when forces are transmitted to the head. So think whiplash, that kind of thing. It's not just about, having that blow to the head. This is why we'd say, a helmet will not prevent every concussion, because you don't have to actually hit your head to have a concussion. Another important point added in is that some cases have the symptoms that appear right away. And in some cases, they evolve over time. So maybe somebody doesn't quite feel right. And over the next minutes to hours, those symptoms become worse with time. And it also clearly states in the consensus statements that you may or may not have a loss of consciousness. And there are a range of clinical symptoms. These are important points because these are going to come back to some questions that we asked in our survey. So you can see that the definition of a concussion has changed over time, and that has really led to people having a wide range of understanding of what a concussion actually is. Even though, especially in the last decade, it's been in the news a lot of people are talking about it, a lot of parents are concerned about it. We still don't have a good consensus definition that is just commonly known to the public. There have been several studies that have looked at this idea. We did some of them at Boston University with athletes. So you would think that these athletes, almost everyone in these studies reached out to us to participate. So they're concerned about it. These are people who want to participate in research on concussions. So you would think that they would tend to be more educated on concussions to start with. We'd ask them, how many concussions have you had? They'd give us a number like 2 or whatever it was. And then we'd read them this definition, that some people have the misconception that concussions only happen when you black out after a hit to the head, or when the symptoms last for a while. But in reality, a concussion has occurred anytime you've had a blow to the head that caused you to have symptoms for any amount of time. These symptoms include this long list: blurred vision, seeing stars, sensitivity to light or noise, confusion. And then we'd end with, when anyone gets a ding or gets their bell rung, that too is a concussion. And after that, we would ask them, based on this definition, how many concussions have you had? So the 2 studies that we did at Boston University, one was with 472 current and former athletes in a wide variety of sports. And 3/4 of them at least doubled, or on average, doubled their estimate. So 3/4 of them increased their estimate after that definition. And that estimate at least doubled based on the median. So we use median here because it's very skewed. If you use mean, I've had people tell me thousands of times, this happened every time I played. So when you really get that definition, some people will say, oh, I can't even put a number on the number of concussions I've had. When we looked at this with former NFL players who have probably a longer playing history, that post-definition number was 5 times greater. So one thing to note about the study of all athletes from a variety of sports, the type of sport didn't matter. So whether they played a contact sport or a contact collision sport or not contact didn't matter. That misconception still held. It also didn't matter what level they played to. They still had that misconception. This 5 times greater is pretty striking. Other groups have looked at this too. A group in Iceland looked at current elite female athletes only and found that they asked the question a little bit differently. They had ranges of concussions and they looked at it at the number of people who said they had never had a concussion and changed that to how many people then reported anything after the definition, and 1/4 of them increased their answer from 0 to 1 or more. And Wickland and colleagues looked at kids. So they were looking at middle school and high school athletes and found that 30% of them increased the number of concussions they reported. In that definition, they included that it could also be caused not just from a hit to the head, but a blow to the body as well. So they tweaked the definition a little bit. But even in kids, like middle school kids who didn't have that much time to accumulate concussions, they still increased their number when given a definition. So an accurate definition is really important. If we are asking our athletes, pre-participation exams, how many concussions you have, and we're not giving them a definition, we're not getting an accurate history. Same with if we are asking that, post-concussion, when we're presenting concussion education. We need to just not just give blow to the head, here's some symptoms. We need to be really specific about the definition we're giving. And we also need to be specific in research. So anytime you're reading a paper about concussions, look for the definition they use, because it can greatly impact the number that we actually see. And this is one thing I should mention, though, is that knowledge doesn't change behavior. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the knowledge and the similar types of questions that we ask in our rugby players. But I need to acknowledge that having knowledge doesn't mean that we change our reporting behavior. For example, studies done by a colleague Christine Bond in Colorado. This is of college football players. They had an average of 4 unreported concussions for every 1 reported concussion, and an average of 19 dings or bell runs for every 1 reported concussion. And they knowingly continued to play with symptoms at least 7 times in their career. Many other studies. This is just one more example of club athletes who reported that they just, even though they had good concussion knowledge, they wouldn't report their concussion for a variety of reasons. So knowledge does not equal change of behavior, but we can't expect somebody to report a concussion if they don't even know that they have a concussion. So it's a piece of the puzzle. So I was interested kind of from this background information in our USMLR players, given this wide variety of background, playing internationally, many of them from other countries. What's the background, and how does that relate to how they would report? So we asked them during your rugby career, how many times do you think you had a concussion? And the average was 2.38 times. I'm going to guess that's a little low, given the long career of many of these individuals, and given what we know about the epidemiology of concussions in rugby. It seems a bit low. But then when we asked them during your rugby career, how many times did you have a ding or have your bell rung? That jumped up to 9.25. We didn't ask the full concussion definition because the survey was a bit long to begin with. But this was a significantly higher number of ding, bell rung versus concussions. And really, this should be included in this definition. We also asked them concussion knowledge questions. And I pulled specifically the knowledge questions that might encourage someone to report their concussion because they actually know that it is a concussion. So those questions were or the statements, I should say, and they had to say if they agreed or disagreed, essentially, on a 5-point Likert scale. And they were that a loss of consciousness is required to diagnose a concussion. It's always easy to tell if someone has a concussion based on how they look or act. A concussion can only occur if there's a direct hit to the head, and signs or symptoms of concussion always appear right away after a big hit. So these are questions that if they agree with these statements, they may not report a concussion because they don't realize that they have a concussion. So it was really striking to me in particular, this number that for the statement, a loss of consciousness is required to diagnose a concussion, only about 60% of the athletes disagreed with that statement. In most studies that have used these statements in the past, it's somewhere between 5 to 10% of people disagree with this statement. So this number is really high compared, well, the 40% that don't, or that do agree, like that's really high. This is really different than most studies. And only about 54% of them disagreed with the statement that it's easy to tell if a person has a concussion. So if they think that a loss of consciousness is required, and they think it's always easy to tell, even though we know that athletes have concussion symptoms all the time, then how is that influencing that number of concussions that they reported and the number of ding bell rungs that they reported? And this is very preliminary. So, we want to know if there's this association between that knowledge and their self-reported history. And I'm just digging into this data now, so we have more analysis to do. But there is a correlation, but it's kind of interesting. So, not surprisingly, those who disagreed with that statement, those who knew that you did not have to lose consciousness to have a concussion. As we got further from this disagree, they reported fewer. So if you think it's necessary to have a concussion or to lose consciousness, then you're going to think that less of those impacts you experienced are concussions. Minus these few up here, which are a bit concerning, that if you think you have to lose consciousness and then you have 10 concussions, it's a bit concerning there. And that was moderately correlated. So that knowledge question was moderately correlated with their concussion history. But it's also been correlated with the number of bell rung or dings that they reported. And if we take the number of bell rungs scenarios that they've had and subtract the concussions, not a perfect number, as the definition studies were, but it gives us some idea of maybe they have a better idea of what a concussion is, or less of an idea if that number is larger. We're also seeing a correlation there. So maybe the athletes who know that loss of consciousness is not required are just more in tune and more aware of concussions to begin with. And so maybe they're noticing those things in bell rung scenarios more. I don't know. There's a lot that we have to look into yet on this to kind of parse this out. We had 48 players that specifically reported that in their time in the USMLR, they experienced concussion symptoms after a hit and did not report. So they unreported concussions specifically in the USMLR. And those findings we saw before kind of fit with this idea, and previous research fits with this idea, that there are many potential reasons that we don't report. But the two knowledge-based questions, 35% of those that didn't report didn't know they had a concussion, and 62% didn't think it was a serious injury, which is very interesting because when we actually asked the question of, do you think a concussion is serious? Something around, I think 5 people said no. So it's, maybe they didn't think the injury that they specifically had was serious, but they think a concussion is serious. It's interesting, that response. But these were two of the higher driving numbers for not reporting too. Yes, people want to keep playing. They want to stay in the game. They don't want to lose practice time or playing time. But these are still pretty high compared to the other numbers they reported. I also looked at concussion education, and had they received it either prior to the USMLR or in the USMLR, and if that related to the knowledge questions at all, and it had no association at all. So either the concussion education that we are providing is really bad, or is not effective anyway, or it just really doesn't matter if they have that education or not. They're getting that knowledge from somewhere else. So this is another thing that we need to dive into, and hopefully this knowledge of these misconceptions can be something that we will recommend to the league, as these are areas we really need to focus on in a tailored education, hopefully more effective education, to help increase safety in the league. I just looked at this kind of quickly because I think this is an interesting thing. We talked about how education and knowledge does not equal behavior change. But another piece is this idea of that kind of borders that attitudes and behaviors and the knowledge, is this idea of, is a concussion really an injury? You hear in sports this idea of, are you hurt or are you injured? If you're hurt, you can play hurt, but you can't play injured. So we asked that question. If you have a concussion, are you always hurt? Are you always injured? We did ask, are you only injured if the symptoms last a long time, or only injured if you lose consciousness? And surprisingly, very few people, just a handful of people, said you're only injured if you lose consciousness, despite some of the other findings we have. But I grouped the only injured if and hurt together, and then the you're always injured together, because those kind of ambiguous and you might be hurt questions weren't very many that responded to that. Did a chi-square with this, and we saw that Those who, the way to interpret this is that if they're more likely to consider having a concussion to be an injury if they thought that loss of consciousness was required or was not required, excuse me. So there was a relationship here. If you have that knowledge that you know that you don't have to lose consciousness, that you consider this to be some sort of injury, even if it doesn't have to be that severe that you lose consciousness, that you're more likely to think of it as an injury. So I'm not 100% sure what to make of this yet, but this is something we're going to dive into with more of these questions of how this concept of being hurt versus injured really plays into reporting and some of the other attitudes and beliefs that they have. And even regardless of the loss of consciousness, most people thought it was an injury. And only 5 players indicated that a concussion is not serious. And even then, only 20 players indicated that having your bell rung was not serious. Yet, how they actually report their history and their knowledge doesn't necessarily fit with that. So, things that we need to explore. As I mentioned, knowledge does not equal change in behavior. This is one piece of the puzzle. And if we can really hone in on those things that are knowledge pieces, that where people don't know what a concussion is, and we can help correct those misconceptions, maybe that's one piece of the puzzle that will make a difference for some athletes in reporting these injuries. We really need to make sure we're providing an accurate definition at all points in education, in getting our concussion history, pre-concussion and pre-participation, post-concussion. We always need to make sure we're being very clear about what a concussion is. And within the USMLR population, there were a lot of misconceptions that may influence their concussion reporting. And then hopefully these are places where we can make a difference by correcting those misconceptions, though they're probably misconceptions that are very deep-rooted. A lot of these players have been playing for decades. So, how do we actually make that change in an effective way? Can we, in many cases? Some future directions for this. We just need to dive more into the data. There's so much data that we have. And we are presenting a white paper to Major League Rugby Players Association, likely in the next 3 weeks. We'll be doing that. And eventually we want to do a follow-up survey. So we want to provide recommendations and help produce some educational materials and recommendations that they can implement, and then follow up. And we can't know if this was even worthwhile or any of it's working if we don't follow up again and study it more. And then kind of clinically, I'm interested in this idea of, how these misconceptions really play into the concussion reporting. Because we talk about in the literature, there's a lot in the literature about how knowledge doesn't equal behavior change, and how sometimes knowledge can change reporting intention, but intention is very different than executing that reporting. It's very different intending to do something versus actually doing it. But most of that is just grouping a bunch of knowledge questions together. Some of those knowledge questions are specific to, do I even know it's a concussion? And some are consequence-based. But I haven't really found anything that's looked at, if you believe this about loss of consciousness, this influences how you report. And I think that's something we need to look at more closely, because maybe there are areas that we can target that would make a difference, at least for some athletes. And maybe it's worthwhile that instead of just saying, here's some concussion education, whether that's a little presentation or handouts or whatever, we know handouts aren't super effective, but maybe as part of the preseason concussion education, we should be doing a little survey like this. So, 7 to 8 questions about what is your concussion knowledge. And then we can actually target those misconceptions with those specific athletes and say, hey, we know that you said you think you have to lose consciousness, but you really don't. Only 10% of concussions result in a loss of consciousness, and that's probably an overestimate. So maybe there are ways that we can use a simple survey to help better educate by targeting misconceptions within our population. realizing that everybody's coming from different backgrounds, lower socioeconomic status is associated with lower concussion knowledge. In our USMLR group, hugely international, that makes a difference. So it's important things to think about. I just want to end with this couple of slides in this idea. It is not all about concussions, right? So I just talked a lot about concussions, but we need to keep in mind that this whole idea of brain safety in sport is about way more than concussions. These subconcussive impacts seem to matter. We used to think that just the repetitive impacts, if you didn't have symptoms, weren't important. And there's just been mounting evidence through imaging, through a variety of different types of studies showing that hitting your head repeatedly will change the brain preseason to postseason, whether you have a concussion or not. And CTE has been diagnosed in individuals with no documented concussion. Documented reported concussion is different, of course they may not have reported, but these repetitive impacts matter. Some may disagree with the idea that even having a ding or having your bell rung is a concussion. And I would argue that something is happening in your brain to make that occur, right? You don't just see stars or feel like you have your bell rung because you're fine. Something happened in your brain. And if we know that subconcussive impacts are also affecting the brain over time, accumulating that, something's happening. We don't entirely know how meaningful everything is here for the long term, the short term, how many of these smaller impacts, this continuum to how many concussions. We have so much to learn. So concussions are only a piece of the puzzle. The knowledge about concussions is only a piece of the puzzle. We have all these puzzle pieces on the edges and so much to fill in the middle. So this idea of brain safety in sport and concussions, this isn't going anywhere. We have so much to learn yet to help the safety of our players, because we want sports. Sports are so important culturally, just countless benefits of sports. How can we make these sports safer for everyone involved at every level? That, happy to take any questions.
Julie, I missed part of your talk about it. The one question I had that rose was like the difference in sport culture.
Yeah.
And you, I mean, if you already addressed that, I'm sorry that I missed it, but it's like the culture of, say, rugby versus soccer or other sports in reporting.
Yeah, the culture piece is huge, and it's so hard to change culture. And as far as reporting, I don't know that there's a cultural difference necessarily. I think it's a sport different. Sports in general has this culture of you just want to play through, and I think that these contact sports like rugby and football are kind of really that's so strong in those sports that you have to play through, you have to be tough. And I think that we need to change that culture of valuing health and as part of toughness, that sometimes the tough thing to do is that sitting out and valuing your health is the tough thing. And it's not just concussions, we're reporting too. When we look at changes that have happened over as a result of laws with regard to just repetitive impacts. Studies have looked at places where contact time has been decreased to try to reduce impacts. And some programs, some high schools had reduced impacts. Some high schools actually ended up having more impacts when that contact time was reduced, because the coaches are like, just cram them all in a shorter amount of time. We have to hit as much as we can because we don't have as much time to hit. They end up hitting more. And that's a cultural piece too, right? So there's so much to change with the culture. I think another piece, particular would be with USMLR, and it's just as we get to higher levels, is it's not just about I want to keep playing. This is my career, or this is my scholarship on the line. So those are factors that are really hard to fight against in this. many of the players in the USMLR have played overseas and maybe they're not the prime to play in some of these bigger leagues. So now they're here in the USMLR and it's what they've got. They don't want to lose this career that they're in. So that's another big piece that it's really hard to push against.
Yeah, and when you're speaking about like the difference between like hurt and injured, I was wondering about the social pressures that come with that, as opposed like one is the nature of the sport, contact sport, like tough sport, like rugby, football, perceived to be tough sport. Then the other is across any team sport of like, you don't necessarily see a concussion in your teammate. And whether in team sports, there's more of a pressure that I can't let my teammates down than maybe in like an individual sport.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And it's actually, we have a lot of that data. We just haven't totally looked at it yet. But one thing that's been interesting in some of Christine's work that she's done with pluralistic ignorance and this idea of, I think my teammates believe this, but my teammates actually believe that. We looked at a very little bit of this with this study, and it really seems that the rugby players want their teammates to report. So they report that they think it's important for their teammates to report a concussion and they value the health of their teammates. But they themselves perceive that their teammates wouldn't think that they should report or would think that they were not as tough, or they'd be letting their teammates down if they reported. And same with their coaches, that they think that they'd be letting their coach down or their coach wouldn't support them if they reported. And even the league wouldn't support them. So there's this discrepancy between what the coaches or what the athletes believe, the coaches and their teammates think, where they think that they wouldn't be supported. But when you ask the athletes themselves, they say, no, I want my teammates to report and I want them to value their health. So it's an interesting thing that maybe that's another thing that we need to target a little bit in concussion education and interventions like that, because if everybody knew that everybody actually supported it, maybe it would be they'd feel more comfortable reporting.
That seems like when you said knowledge does not equal behavior change. So you're speaking a lot of like knowledge of the science of the injury, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Or because what you just said now is interesting, even because that's a kind of knowledge as well. Like knowledge of what my teammates want. Is there any effort being made anywhere to have these, like, one is we need to know the science of the brain and what happens with these, but the other is like we need to talk among teammates about what we expect of each other, how we're going to address this together.
Yeah, so when we do talk about knowledge and research, we are talking about like loss of consciousness is not required. A second concussion can take longer to recover, or you may be at risk for a second concussion if you go back too early. Those are the kind of things that we typically ask. And that has not, knowing that hasn't been correlated with behavior because we're really bad at judging risk and that kind of thing. But we haven't done a lot of research into that idea of knowledge of these perceptions. And Christine's doing some of that. It's a little bit with the pluralistic ignorance of it, at least. This is the difference in perceptions, but there hasn't been a lot about if we do an intervention with this and actually let everyone know that everyone else supports them, how that affects things. There's some evidence that shows that if a coach promotes a culture that health is valued, and if a coach shows that they want athletes to report, that really does influence reporting. So there's more of that on the coach side. And there are a lot of initiatives like the Concussion Legacy Foundation has Team Up, Speak Up, where they really encourage conversations with the team and teammates encouraging other teammates to report, that kind of thing. So there are initiatives going into that, but I think the outcomes of that have yet to really be examined.
To your comment on like the coaches and how it's creating that culture, has there been any research done with either the coaches or referees on their knowledge of what a concussion definition is? And because at least in our environment, I know it's not USMLR, but the coaches or the are oftentimes responsible for determining if a student or a player can go back to play. So has there been anything done from their perspective on what?
Yeah, there's been a fair amount of research in concussion knowledge with coaches, but not on the actual definition piece. To my knowledge, I don't know anything on the definition piece. And same kind of with parents too, who are often coaches, or especially if you level around kids, right? In that case, you know, there's definitely evidence to show that their knowledge is ingrained. But not necessarily about the definition. I have some preliminary data with hockey parents where the definition trend shows through, but I don't have a very big end, so it's not as strong as I'd like it to be. But yeah, we don't really have that kind of thing with coaches. But from what I'm remembering from the coach data, it's kind of similar in that just because they have the knowledge doesn't mean that they're actually going to support the athlete in the moment, in the game, and support them in reporting. But there is the data that if a coach creates this environment where it's known among the team that they encourage reporting, athletes are more confident in reporting. There's also data that freshman football players in college are more likely to feel comfortable reporting, or at least have better reporting intention than seniors. So there's something learned along the time, in part probably from the coaching staff, that they've learned this idea that they shouldn't be reporting over time, which is also a concerning thing for sure.
Great talk. I learned so much. I was so neat. So I guess I have two quick questions. One is just kind of like a historical thing, that the document that you showed from 1933
Yeah,
from the NCAA, I thought was such a neat thing that you found, like that they acknowledged that something like concussions existed all the way back then, especially about football. I thought was particularly interesting. So they had this report, and I guess maybe you don't have the answer to this, but like, to what end? Like, what do they do with that information? Like, once that report was out there, did that like change the way that the sport looked, or did that and like make it so that there was like rule changes at the time? So you might not have an answer to that. So I did have a question about this idea about the concept of getting dinged or having your bell rung. In the first study that you showed, were you saying, just make sure I got this, that you were counting that as a concussion? So it was, have you had a concussion? And then here's another set of questions. Have you had your bell rung? Have you had a ding? And if they answered yes, you counted that as a concussion?
so within the USMLR group, yeah, so we had those as completely separate questions. And this is where we need to kind of go back in and resurvey them and ask it in a different way.
Right.
Because you can't parse out if they thought the ding or bell rung was a concussion or not. Because that number was a lot lower. We just asked how many concussions have you had? So we did not combine that.
Right, but you took it as evidence that if they said I got my bell rung or if I got dinged, you counted that as being like they were concussed.
It, in the sense that, like, by definition, and it's what we consider the conservative definition, then it should have been considered a concussion.
Okay, so that's really interesting to me then. That's so cool then, because then what you're saying is that these sports have always had language to talk about concussions too. Like it kind of like baked into the culture. There's always been a way to talk about like brain injury, like implicitly.
Yeah, and with rugby, the other one that I didn't mention here, but that's really a big part of it is the term head knock. And sometimes some rugby players and people involved will say like, oh, they just mean they hit their head. But some people refer to that as a concussion. And so to me, that terminology is lessening and you know, the idea of the fact this is a brain injury. And they're like, oh no, I just had a head knock, I didn't have a concussion, or I just had my bell rung, I didn't have a concussion. So we're trying to parse out like, did you actually think that having your bell rung was a concussion? And when I did that analysis where I took the bell rung minus concussion, there were some that were negative. So some people had reported maybe 10 concussions, and 2 of those they called bell rung, and the others were concussions. So it seemed to indicate that some of them thought the bell rung was a concussion. Then other people reported 100 bell rung and 2 concussions. So they're clearly not considering a bell rung to be a concussion. So even though we have this nomenclature that, you know, exists throughout the history, whether or not we actually take it seriously differs greatly from person to person. And other research has shown that differs based on your concussion history. In both directions, sometimes people are more likely to consider having their bell rung concussion if they've had one. But in other cases, people are less likely to report because they know the consequences of reporting and they feel that those are negative consequences. So yeah, it's very interesting, like trying to figure out what the starting place is so we can actually make a difference. That is interesting. With the historical piece, I don't know specifically from that handbook, but I know, concussion outcomes and trauma has definitely changed sport over time. The NCAA was formed because too many football players were dying on the field. And Roosevelt came in and said, hey, we have to do something. And they formed the NCAA. And the leather helmets came in, even though that didn't really do very much. And there have been a lot of responses to how concussion has changed the game, different helmets, this idea that this should be taken seriously. But even then, saying that most of these concussions have brain bleeds, but then you don't actually have to lose consciousness, it's still contradicting itself. So how much of a difference it actually made on the field, we don't know. I mean, even into the 90s or later, like we didn't consider having your bell rung to be a concussion. We'd say that when I was coming up in athletic training, it was still, well, if your symptoms subside in 15 minutes, then you're probably fine to go back in the game. And in just the last 15 years, we've learned so much. 20 years, so much has changed. So yeah, it's very interesting. And it's really interesting looking back historically too, because one thing was, in the early 2000s, people were like, CTE doesn't happen in football players. This is crazy. 1933, they knew, but
That's why I was blown away by that. What a cool thing to find.
yeah, Stephen, now I can't think of his last name. I can find the name for you, but there's a great historian, Stephen Casper, that's his name. He's a historian that dives really into all of this and also posts a lot of it on Twitter. So he's a great one to follow for some of these historical cases.
I have one other question, Julie, about you. Did you say that lower SES correlates with lower concussion awareness?
Yeah, there's been some really interesting data coming out more recently about reporting and knowledge based on socioeconomic status. And it's been really like I have to read even deeper into it, but it's been in the last year or two that some of this data has come out about both SES and race and how concussions are perceived and the knowledge base.
Yeah. That would be interesting to see that. And then also, I was wondering even if like geographically, there are different levels of awareness, different regions of the country. You referred to kind of like international and differences internationally, but I even wonder within one country, like within the US, how that plays out. If there are interesting differences.
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen anything on geographic regions. I think we can all say, like, culturally, like football is life in the South in a way that's different and bigger in the Midwest compared to when I was out in Boston. Like there were big Boston schools that could hardly field the team, so there's very different feeling about some of these sports regionally. And so I would think there probably are some big differences. I know that internationally, like with CTE, for example, other countries, a decade ago were like, this is an American football problem. This is not something we need to worry about. And now there are just cases mounting in rugby and Australian rules football. There are cases growing in soccer. So now it's, Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, England, like all over Europe, this is starting to grow. That's only been in the last 3 to 5 years. And that has now changed how, like, for example, they're talking about heading in soccer and how they're initiating that. So, or introducing that. So now kids can't head until a certain age, and then they're slowly increasing heading over time in places where soccer is life from, the minute you can walk, right? So we're starting to see some of those changes happen now that are just lagging behind because we thought It's an American football problem. So I think that's where culturally thinking about some of our international players, they just may not have had that education or knowledge or held some of these misconceptions because it just was culturally where it was. Mhm.
Well, this next, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
you.
so much for having me.
That's fascinating, fascinating stuff.